Here is something that I think we can all agree on. Drug companies, big pharma, those folks are blood-sucking, greedy cheats who cannot be trusted with the health and welfare of tens of millions of people. We've known that for a very long time. Am I right? And that's even more true as we watch this global competition to be the first company to profit big time from a vaccine for COVID-19. So I'm going to focus on the pharma corruption today with a friend and investigative reporter, Gerald Posner, who is the author of a new in-depth book about big pharma. This is Jonathan Tasini, and it's great to have you on our show for July 15th, 2020. As usual, just a reminder, our major sponsor is the American Postal Workers Union, which fights for dignity, respect, and good wages for its 200,000 members and retirees, and of course, 2,000 private sector mail workers. You too can become a small donor, small supporter of this show. You can do that in two ways, as I often remind people. You can either do that through Patreon, and you can find Patreon by going over to our main website, workinglife.org, clicking on the podcast tab and finding your way over to Patreon. Or if you're more comfortable and more familiar with ActBlue, we've partnered up with ActBlue, and you can donate and become a supporter, either a one-time supporter or an ongoing monthly contributor at ActBlue. And either of those places helps us gather contributions, gather support, so we can keep bringing you the show and bring you this information I just think you don't get in probably most places around the media culture and the media ecosphere. So if you are wondering how you can personally be useful in the next couple of weeks, here's the single most important thing, in my opinion, that you can do as an individual and gather other people to do the same thing by the end of July to slow the pandemic and reverse its spiral that's going upwards now and make it come down. Bend the curve, as they say. And this is simply a point that I made last week when I discussed my proposal for a $6.5 trillion stimulus, which I think is completely rational and doable. And you can go back to our episode last week and catch up on what I was proposing if you haven't had a chance, and spread it around. Maybe we can get a little movement going around it. But this is the one thing you can do right now, and that is badger everyone you know, especially your Congress critter, and get them to support Pramila Jayapal and her bill in the House, which is called H.R. 6918, the Paycheck Recovery Act, and a similar bill in the Senate that's co-sponsored by Bernie Sanders and several other senators. Now, her bill would allocate money to pay people up to $90,000 a year until the unemployment rate declines in 3 straight months below 7%. And this is economic and medical logic. Pay people enough money so they can pay their bills like rent and food, and that also allows them to stay home, to not feel forced to have to go to work when they're sick, certainly because they're sick, or to simply allow a government, local or state, to impose a lockdown so we can bend that curve down, get the pandemic under control, do the kind of testing that you have to do and the contact tracing, but allow people to stay home and have enough money to pay their bills and not feel the need and the desire or the urge, the urgent urge to basically go to work. Jayapal's bill was not included in the $3 trillion package that was passed recently by the House because the House leadership, Nancy Pelosi, and her crew do not support it. They've embraced, as I said last week, the completely insufficient, pathetic monthly payments that simply don't cover people's real expenses. And just to reiterate, my issue with Jayapal's bill was simply one, that it costed it out only for 6 months, and I think we have to pass it for a full year, and that's a minimum, because any half-assed analysis that I've seen, I'm sure you've seen the same ones, show that this economic crisis will last well into 2021 and probably beyond, unfortunately, and the unemployment rate is likely to stay above 7% for a year and, frankly, a lot longer, which is sad, but it is the reality, and it's the time now to push and press for this kind of stimulus now because people need this money urgently. So speaking of greed, and that would be about big pharma, right? How greedy are these folks? There are so many ways to count that I just decided to take one. I looked at the CEO compensation for the top CEOs at these big drug companies. Here's a list. And the list goes on. And I just took the first 20 on the list. And this is categorized by healthcare companies. So it's not just big pharma. But in those top 20 salaries of CEOs, those top 20 compensation packages, which is salary plus pension and all sorts of other benefits, just to remind people, it's not the paycheck that they get every 2 weeks that's the big money, even though it's way more than any of us get. It's really what they get in other benefits, especially pension benefits, that gives them tens of millions of more dollars. So I took a look at this list, and in the top 20 of the healthcare industry are 10 CEOs of big pharma. Just read you a couple of those. Roger Naron Pharmaceuticals, which I totally bungled. Leonard Schleifer, the CEO, makes $26.5 million. That was in 2018. Gilead Sciences, CEO there, John Milligan, 25.9. Let's call it, it's almost $26 million. AbbVie Inc., CEO's name is Richard Gonzalez. What did he pull in? $21.2 million. Merck, which is a name that you're familiar with. The Kenneth Fraser is the CEO there. He earned a cool $20.9, almost $21 million in 2018. And just to take one more, just because you know the name, Pfizer, the CEO there is Ian Reed, and he made $19.5 million in 2018. So now you understand the core reason why these guys fight like hell to keep drug prices high and keep control over their patents and their monopoly pricing, because the drug prices we pay in the US only make sense because of greed, corruption, lies, and has nothing to do with the actual real cost of the drugs. And so I thought it would be a good time to peek inside this deeply corrupt industry, largely because of what we read about now every day. As I said, that desperate attempt to find a vaccine for COVID-19 to save lives all around the world, and actually also prevent massive sickness of millions of more people, because we know now that people who get sick from the virus actually are left with sometimes lifelong medical problems in their kidneys, their lungs, their heart. And so even if you're a young person in your 20s and you say, oh, I'm not going to die from this, if you get sick, you may have medical problems for the next 50, 60, 70 years of your life. And as usual, your tax dollars are being put right now into the hands of big pharma companies to develop this vaccine. And there's a lot of double talk and really misleading promises coming out from those big pharmaceutical companies about what we are going to be charged if there is a vaccine and who will get it first if and when that vaccine is discovered. So it's perfect timing. A good friend of mine, Gerald Posner, has written a mind-blowingly in-depth book called, quote, Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America, which kind of sums it all up. And I was happy to purchase that copy, which I learned a lot from. I read it. You should buy it like right away. Don't buy it from Amazon. You can buy it at a gazillion independent bookstores. You can buy it online. Don't keep putting money into Jeff Bezos's pocket, please. And so it's great to welcome Gerald to the show for this incredible conversation about big pharma and its, as he puts it in his title, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. And so, Gerald, you have written really what I think is the book about the big pharma. And let's face it, you're talking to an audience, my audience, but probably the American public that has not a great deal of trust in big pharma. And the book is entitled Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America, which kind of sums up what I think, generally speaking, people think about the drug industry. They're not held in high regard. But I want to start with this macro framing, if I can, then let you riff on this. When I read the book, and it's a really fantastic book, I urge my audience to get it. One of the things that Gerald always does in the history of all the books he's done, he's incredibly meticulous. And you've got a 750-page book here, but a third of that is notes, bibliography, and an index. And literally, it's really is meticulous. So when I finished it, The big frame I thought about was that this book really is emblematic of the system generally, the economic system, and healthcare in particular, in three ways. Healthcare, as you well know, was tied crazily to our employers, which allowed in some way costs to go out of control at one point because employers just were paying the drug industry and they were happy to pocket the profits. The second thing, which I think is emblematic both of healthcare but generally the system, is that we have such weak government regulation. You look at that when it comes to safety and health, like OSHA. We build these networks of government regulation that, because of the inherent philosophy here to not have really strong government, it's always going to be weak when it comes to looking at the bad boys and trying to essentially control big corporations. And the last point, which is greed, the human nature, and the whole way in which you weave the greed of the Sackler family, who are the big parts of your book here, the big subjects. It's greed is driving it. So, what do you think about how all those three things connect in terms of your book?
Yeah, Jonathan, you're absolutely right. I mean, first of all, regarding the way that our healthcare system works, so that essentially employers are covering healthcare costs for most employees, and that was certainly the case in the 50s and 60s. So as a result, when the pharmaceutical industry, which really started to grow, I mean, they didn't exist until after penicillin and World War II, when they started to become big companies and dominate the business and dominate the international trade in the 50s and 60s, individuals, most people who were working for somebody, didn't feel the pinch of the price of drugs because their employers were picking it up entirely. So nobody was out there complaining about the fact that they were paying through the nose for drugs or they couldn't afford them. Now, over time, of course, what happened is insurance companies got clever and they started to dice it up. And you see the way that they've created different levels of the business, making it even more obtuse and arcane for anybody to figure out in terms of pharmacy benefit managers and all these middle people. And now many people do, in fact, for the last 30 years, feel the price of drugs. They can't afford them. They know how bad it is. So our system is built on a decrepit and outmoded way of distributing drugs and pricing them. And the only person that gets hit in the end is the consumer, the patient in this odd business. And it's odd because remember, the manufacturer here isn't selling directly to the consumer, the patient. They're selling through middle people, doctors. So they have to encourage the doctors to dispense the prescriptions. And the doctors don't know the price of the medications most of the time that they're writing for the patients. They have no idea when you walk out of a doctor's office if your copay is $10, $40, or you don't have insurance at all, unless they ask, and often they don't. Uh, the second part of what you talked about, the regulatory system, even when it's, first of all, there's no regulation at all. Nobody even looked at regulating drugs until 1906 with the Pure Food and Drugs Act, and that was really more focused on food. So it was the Wild West before that. Everything was legal: heroin, cocaine, morphine, cannabis, all mixed in different potions. Bayer was selling heroin and trademarked the name. There are no prescriptions required in the United States for any drug at all, even for controlled substances, until 1938. And then afterwards, there are no drugs prescriptions really required until the 50s for items like penicillin and other antibiotics. So for a long time, the regulation was non-existent. And the only reason we kick it in 62 is because of the thalidomide scare, when everybody gets scared about, this over-the-counter European anti-nausea medication taken by expectant mothers that actually turns out with horrible birth deformities. And that scares Congress into passing all the clinical trials and everything we know now. But what's the end result? The FDA is outwitted, outmatched, and overwhelmed at every point, as you know, through its history. Pharma is smarter, better funded. They're able to crush the regulators when they need to and get around and find the loopholes. And when you get to the very last part, you're right. It's human nature. It's like any other industry. You're going to get greed. But here, what is so infuriating about it for me, and I've done a dozen books on other items and topics that make me infuriated, but this one in particular is because we're at the intersection of health. And when there's greed involved, not only do we get price gouging, but we get individuals or companies that hide the bad side effects and adverse effects as they roll in because they don't want to stop the gravy train of a best-selling drug. So for 15 years, women are buying the first oral contraceptive from Cyril, thinking that it's all right, and Cyril's hiding the evidence about the breast cancer and endometrial cancer and blood clots. The same thing's happening on hormone replacement therapy from Wyeth for nearly 15 years, hiding all the information about cancer for women and selling the product. So here you have not only greed, does it result in us losing our money, but in some cases it results in people losing their lives.
Right, and I remember in reading your book that at one point when in the 1960s, this goes to your point about drugs, when there was an investigation and there was a drug efficacy study, as you well know, under the auspices of this guy named Goddard, who tried to clamp down a little bit, only 12% of the drugs delivered on their promised claims. And even I am, who's pretty cynical about the drug company, I was shocked that they got away with that.
Yeah, it is remarkable because, first of all, you used to be able to make the claim they were never tested for efficacy, which is remarkable. So until 1962, you were able to put a drug out, and all you had to do was pass what I called a very low threshold for safety. The threshold was, if I summarize it, it might be a bit of an overstatement, but as long as we don't kill you, it's all right to have it out. And the efficacy was just based on the claim. And then once they started to test them, you're right, we're talking almost 90% end up failing. Even today, remember, when a drug gets passed for effective therapeutic treatment, it depends on what the standard has been set by the FDA. So here we are in the middle of COVID-19 and everybody's looking for the vaccine coming down the road. The FDA just 2 weeks ago set out the parameters for what the approval would be for a vaccine. It has to be 50% efficacy. Now, I will tell you that a lot of infectious disease doctors I'm speaking to now were shocked by that. They thought the level would be at least 70%, more like a bad influenza year. So what 50% tells me is they're looking to get a vaccine passed early. And that really means that in 1 out of 2 people that will end up taking the vaccine, they have to show evidence of antibodies to COVID. That's all. So people who look at the vaccine as being a cure-all, they don't know how drugs work. It will be effective, but not by the standards of what the layperson thinks.
Meaning that you have no worries anymore.
That's right. People think of it like the polio vaccine. You go to get the polio vaccine. I got it when I was a kid. That would be the end of the smallpox vaccine. You would actually eliminate entirely what was taking place. No, that's not what will happen here. As a matter of fact, the moneymaker for COVID, for drug companies, Johnson and Johnson and GlaxoSmithKline, have said we will produce our first batches of vaccine at cost. And at first you think, oh, Mother Teresa has taken over the drug companies. But what it means is, 100 million doses they'll probably give at cost, and Gilead's doing that on remdesivir. They're giving away some free, but then what they're looking for are the booster shots, because they know that this vaccine will not be a one-all. You'll take it once and that's the end of it. They're going to have to give it in additional years, just like they give the pneumonia vaccine, or they give shingles vaccines. In addition, companies or countries will have to stockpile for it, and that stockpiling returns billions of dollars in money. So they know how to work the system pretty well.
So we're going to come back to the COVID pandemic because there's some issues that are really, you don't talk about it specifically in the book, but it just comes out almost every other page. I was thinking, this is relative to right now. But one of the things I want to go back to, and it comes from your title, Greed, part of your title that emphasizes greed. You quoted in the book this Harvard researcher named Max Finland, who said at one point that the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma, and I'm quoting now, should refocus on finding cures and stop judging success only by sales. And the implication of that quote was that there were two parts of the history, if I can use, grossly divided. One part where Big Pharma really cared about actually finding cures versus all of a sudden they turned into money mongers and basically cared only about profits. Can you really divide it that way?
Yeah, not clearly, and but when is that? Max Finland, great guy, fantastic researcher, and just so people who are listening to your podcast will find this interesting. That's about 1960. He's saying that. So at that time, he was already raising the red flag. And what's fantastic is there were people in the early days of pharma, the early days meaning the 1930s and 40s, who George Merck, the great grandson of one of the original Merck founders of the company, had a view that a pharmaceutical company was almost a quasi-public trust. And he said at this graduation ceremony to a group of doctors, we have to follow the drugs. We develop drugs for the people. The profits will follow. And I must tell you that other heads of companies in the 50s, like Jack McKean at Pfizer, who hired Arthur Sackler to roll out his antibiotic, they thought that Merck was an old-fashioned guy whose time had passed him by. The new people were Madison Avenue people who came in. And when you said, can you clearly divide it between the two? I do think there are some great scientists and researchers inside the labs looking for cures, using the genomic system for cures possibly down the road for specific types of cancer, childhood diseases, and other matters. Then there's almost a Jekyll and Hyde quality to the companies. You get it out of the lab, and you move it over to promotion and marketing, and it's like you're giving it to the guys who sell penny stocks inside the boiler room sometimes, to little old ladies in the middle of Kansas, and clean out their bank account for their last $5,000 in savings. So the two sides of the pharmaceutical companies, the ones who are the scientists looking for the cures or the treatments, and the ones who then go out to sell it, that's often like night and day.
Ah, and that's a perfect lead in. You're perfect at this. It's a perfect lead into the next part I wanted to talk about, which circles back to what we talked about a second ago, which is the way in which big pharma overwhelms the FDA and overwhelms the society, and then in some way overwhelms the medical community with their sales and their blitz about drugs. And you chart this multiple times throughout the book, and I wanted to highlight Oxycontin, partly because it really did involve the Sacklers in a very deep way, and also because it's more recent and people relate to that. But here's what they created: a speakers bureau, a 600-person sales force, which was kind of, to me, that was astounding. They basically then gave these huge, big bonuses to sales reps. And you point out that by the year 2000, I believe just for Oxycontin, the bonus was amounted to $40 million. And on the other hand, you had the FDA, which had like 32 employees that had to oversee 35,000 promotional items. So that kind of shows the scale of it, right?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there's one part at which the FDA comes in and actually sends a letter that Purdue has to cease and desist on this advertisement they have. It's a video that they put out. It was 2 years after they had already put the video out. The FDA was that slow in even getting around to it. So you're right. They don't have the personnel to stay on top of it. These drug companies and Purdue is small. It's a one-hit wonder in the sense, like a rock band. They have their one drug, but it's relatively small compared to Johnson and Johnson and the big companies who also had opioid products. It's a tiny player, but tiny meaning that when you get a hit, the money starts to roll in. OxyContin, from its release in 1996 through last year, brought in $35 billion in sales. Put the Sacklers on the Forbes richest families list at $14 billion in 2015, called the OxyContin clan. So, you hit the right drug, and you're off and running. And you're right about the sales team. It's very interesting because they have been able to specialize now on targeting it. They don't just send 600 people out and say to these men and women, go out to every doctor you can find and try to get them to write a prescription for OxyContin. They know which doctors are already writing the big prescriptions for Percocet, which ones are using morphine in end of life situations and in hospice. They know the ones who might be willing to use a pain reliever. Those are the ones they're going to, because 5% of doctors can write 60 or 65% of the prescriptions, even more sometimes in the cases of the opioids.
So if these drug companies become even more sophisticated in the last few years, thanks to essentially what I guess you were saying, data mining, right? They're
That's
able
correct.
to collect all that stuff, shove it into a computer, and get very, very targeted information, the same way that politicians target voters, right?
That's exactly right. And the part that's so outrageous here is that the that means because they were data mining, they knew exactly where all the pills were going. Although later, Purdue has been saying for years now, in a very feeble defense, it's now in bankruptcy court. Well, we didn't know that some pharmacies were getting enough to stock the entire state, and the town only had 4,000 people. Well, I'll tell you something. Not only did they know that, but the distributors, and when I say the distributors knew exactly where every pill was going, I'm not talking about small little companies. The distributors are multi-billion-dollar companies. They're in the top 50 companies in America. It's McKesson, Cardinal Health, Amerisource Bergen. Those companies knew where every pill was going, and they didn't report a single case in which they thought a pill mill was operating. So there's plenty of blame to go around here. Purdue takes the heat of the blame because it was their product, and they deserve a lot of the blame. But they couldn't rob the bank on their own. They needed the getaway driver, and they needed some accomplices. They had it in the distributor. They had it in the pill mill doctors who were running essentially legal, opium, OxyContin dens and dispensing pills as fast as they could. They had it in the FDA, who was overwhelmed and unable to ever do anything about enforcement. So you can go down the line on this. They had it even in the chain pharmacies. Don't let CVS or Walgreens off the list. They were paying some of their pharmacists bonuses for writing more of these prescriptions at a time, turning people to turn to OxyContin as opposed to another generic. So, I could go down the list. It's greed all the way down the chart on this one.
And again, let's underscore the point that you can't have federal regulators trying to keep up with this because they're too sophisticated and too rich. And again, this is so emblematic. It's important to understand this, that This is the problem of our economic system generally, that we allow these corporations, and this big pharma is the greatest example of greed and the way it affects people's health and livelihoods. But it's true about big corporations generally in this system. There's nothing holding them back in the system that we have.
That's right. And it's interesting because I'm writing together with a professor from Illinois who's a bankruptcy law professor. We're writing an op-ed right now, and we're talking about the fact that one of the things that has happened, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, is two things. One, if they get caught, and time again this happens. You see it in the book. They get big fines, 600 million in the case of Purdue in 2007. They were misbranding the drug. 3 top executives pled guilty to felonies, including Purdue. And then from 2008 into 2019, they went on steroids and sold more drugs, breaking all the same rules they broke before. Didn't even hurt them. Other companies paying multi-billion-dollar drugs. And Jonathan, all it is the cost of doing business for them. Reduces their profits a little bit. When they go bankrupt, guess what? When you had a case with Robbins, which was the company that put out an IUD, the Dalcon Shield, years ago, and there were so many injured women from that. They hid the results. There was fraud. When they went bankrupt, the bankruptcy court said to the Robbins family, who had made a fortune off of that product, by the way, you're forgiven. No lawsuits against you. You can contribute to the settlement. They walked away free. And I think that's what's going to happen with the Sackler family. The bankruptcy court is going to give them releases for over 2,000 lawsuits against them. Although Purdue will be finished, they will walk away with billions in oxy profits. So part of the system has to be jail time. I'm sorry. I don't just throw that out lightly because as a lawyer, I understand it's not easy to bring a criminal prosecution, but very seldom are prosecutors interested in going beyond the civil fines. The civil fines are low-hanging fruit. The companies have built that into their budgets almost. You've got to threaten them with the idea that some of these people are going to go to jail as opposed to going back to the country club, and that might scare them a little bit.
Man, that's absolutely true. And it's again analogous to, for example, Wall Street. When you looked at the collapse of the mortgage market, none of those guys went to jail. They kept their fortunes of tens of millions of dollars, the ones that ran those Wall Street firms, the ones even that collapsed. And then you look at worker safety and health. You've got workers dying all the time, not just in this pandemic, but going back decades. And anytime they die, there might be actually much smaller fine than the Sacklers have had to endure. Smaller fines, they're slap on the wrist, but none of these executives go to jail until you take away their freedom. They're not going to think twice about coming back and doing the same thing.
That's exactly right. And it's remarkable to me that we have allowed, and I think that one of the things about pharma is that I'm amazed at how the story just plays itself out again in similar ways, but the drugs change. So, you go through the 60s and the drug of abuse that's the hot drug of the moment that everybody's fallen in love with are amphetamines, and they're opening up diet centers all over, and doctors are abusing it, and they're getting diverted to the street. And then suddenly 10 years later, they find out that people are getting hooked and they stop it. And then they go off on benzodiazepines and it's Valium and Librium and everything else. And then it's replaced by Xanax. Then we go into opioids. And in all of these cases, these drug companies hide the adverse effects. They make the profits. They later get fined. And I will tell you that unless we change that dynamic and really shake it up, there's another thing that I think is absolutely critical. We in this country, we are one of only 2 countries in the world, the other being New Zealand, that allowed drug companies to advertise directly to consumers. Never was allowed in 97. It's crazy in my mind, but okay, that we've allowed that. The second thing is that we really should change is we're the only country on the planet that allows drug companies unfettered pricing power. They can pick the price they want. The market bears it. They can have it. In every other nation, every country in Europe and every place in Australia and Asia, they have to negotiate with a government entity, the government itself, a group of doctors, hospital organizations. Here, that doesn't happen. So as a result, if you're manufacturing a drug and you've got a patent on to sell it in your Bayer or your Glaxo or whatever else, you negotiate with all the other countries first. You know what prices they've gotten you down to. You have your profit that you want to make it 12 or 15% gross profit. And you know, therefore, what price you need to set in the United States. Even Gilead the other day, when it released remdesivir, which is moving out for COVID, was brazen enough to set the price at $2,400 for all of the world for this 7-day treatment. And in the United States, $3,300. So they raised it by a little bit more than a quarter. Why? Because it's the US. And guess what? We allow it to happen. It's absolutely disgraceful.
And I assume that's partly the power of the pharma lobbyist. I know that there have been a number of attempts by Bernie Sanders and others to try to give Medicare the power to basically negotiate those drug prices and then obviously have that as a Medicare for all system. But the Republicans have blocked it. I'm sure, by the way, that they're very friendly Democrats to the pharmaceutical
That,
industry. They probably spread around their money quite evenly on a bipartisan level, but that's why that happens, right?
No question about it. And as a matter of fact, people say to me, "Is this book favorable to Republicans or Democrats?" And I say, "It's not favorable to Republicans. It's not favorable to corporate Democrats." And the real point on this is, look at the very first emergency funding bill that came out on COVID from the federal government, $8.3 billion. $3 billion of that was public money that went to the drug companies for them to use on research for treatments and vaccines. And in the very first draft, there were two clauses, one of which would have given the federal government the real power to come in if the eventual price for a vaccine was unreasonable and hammer it down. And the second was that all of the research done by these companies based upon public money would be available to all. Nobody would have intellectual property rights. Both of those clauses fell out by the time the 8.3 billion was passed. Both parties signed off on it. And recently, when the HEROES Act was passed by the House, Lloyd Doggett, Chowalski, and others tried to get in language that against the profiteering from the pandemic, against price gouging, and the party couldn't even put that in. So I'm upset and disappointed in both sides of the aisle. Some bear more blame than others, but pharma's done a very, very good job of saying, "Oh, don't press us. We're going to find the cure for COVID. We all want to go back to the pre-COVID normal. So don't talk about profits now. It's not the right time," and the parties have agreed.
And so you've raised this very important point, and tell me how phony this argument is. You know this. Big Pharma usually says we have to have a patent and a monopoly on this drug because it needs to pay for the research that we do in the past. And if you don't let us do this, then my God, we're not going to have drugs that are going to save your life. So how much of a BS is that?
Yeah, no, it just steam comes out of my ear. I don't know if it's you can see it on this Zoom, but we need those high prices not to pay for the research that we've done on other drugs, and so we can get great drugs in the future, but to pay for my house in Gstaad and the skiing vacation that I want, and the time that I'm going to be spending down in Bermuda. Let me tell you what the real fact is, and they hate when I say this in the drug industry, but unfortunately, facts are inconvenient sometimes. The top 10 drug companies in the world, they're public companies, so you can look at the facts and the figures yourself of their quarterly reports. On average, for 10 years, they spend more money on stock buybacks and on promotion and marketing than they do on research and development. So I say, you know what, guys, then cut back a little bit on the stock buybacks and you'll have enough money for research and development.
And cut back on the promotion. Believe me, when you see those television commercials that go on and on every hour about these drugs, and especially 90% of it is all the dangers they sort of say underneath the narrator's voice. Don't take this if you have this and this, but that's a side point. But there's a huge amount of money that goes into that, obviously. And that goes back to the other point that you kind of made with the COVID vaccine, but also goes all the way back to penicillin, which is we, the taxpayer, when it comes to research and development, we invest billions of dollars into this research and development, and they still charge these high prices. I mean, they get tax breaks and they get taxpayer money.
No, it's maddening because okay, so on penicillin, it was a U.S. government project, the second secret project behind the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project. We, the U.S. taxpayer, bought the plants and created the big manufacturing plants for the 10 pharmaceutical companies that were part of it. And when they emerged from World War II on steroids, they went from having less than half the world market for drugs before the war to having 70% of it in 1946 after the war and 80% of all profits based on taxpayer funding. And this, Jonathan, is one of my favorite stats. From the late 1930s until today, the US taxpayer through the National Institute of Health has paid $930 billion into public research, which drug companies have then used to patent drugs. Just one quick example. We lived through this in New York, both of us, and we know it. In the 1980s with HIV and AIDS, it was a researcher at the NIH who looked around when they were trying to figure out what could possibly treat it. They had no treatments yet for it. They were looking around and he said, I think that Burroughs has an antiviral that might actually be effective against what we're seeing in the lab. The NIH went to Burroughs and said, by the way, can we get a compound of this drug to test in the lab? Now, Burroughs wasn't using the drug. They had a patent on it, but they had tested it inside and it was too toxic. So it was sitting there, had never been used to make a penny. They couldn't even make the drug because they hadn't made it in so many years. So the NIH gave them the sequence so they could make the drug. Burroughs gave the NIH the compound. The NIH then does a year of testing, taxpayer expense. There's some funding privately from San Francisco. And in the end, they develop AZT, which was the first effective treatment. Burroughs then says, we want it back. They take it, they squabble with the government, they put a patent on it, and they priced AZT at $10,000 a patient, which at the time was a world record. Now, ACT UP and other groups protested that, so Burroughs, in their great generosity, lowered the price to 8,000, still a record. If you had said to me in the early 80s, if I was as aware then as I am now about the way the drug industry works, then in the middle of a crisis that was killing not only gay men and killing people who were hemophiliacs and killing people who are IV drug users and threatening the heterosexual population, that there would be a drug developed at government research and expense that then a private drug company would take and charge the highest price in the world for, I'd say you're crazy. It'll never happen. People will be outraged. They weren't outraged enough. And that is repeated in other instances I could go through. It's just a process that gets followed. And it's remarkable to me that we haven't put a stop to it.
And you kind of reference, I think, and this is one of the last specific topics I want to talk about, the Orphan Drug Act, which to me was really a revelation. I'm really glad you put that in because I had no idea what that was. And essentially, I'm going to explain it very quickly. You'll tell me how off I am. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of drugs that are not good for diseases that treat above 200,000 people. I think that was the number in your book. And those drugs essentially then are given to these companies who decide, okay, we'll put them back into use for may only be useful for 2 or 3,000 folks, and they get then extra patent protection and monopoly rights, and then they sell these. And this drove me crazy. I wrote this down. Orphan drugs, the median cost of such a drug is $98,500. The non-orphan drugs, let's say that these are still overpriced, but the non-orphan drugs, the median cost is $5,000. So they're making OxyContin obviously has a very high visibility, but huge amounts of money are being made for these so-called orphan drugs. Am I explaining this right?
No, you're explaining it exactly right. And I was glad when I did the book because I knew nothing about orphan drugs
Yeah,
beforehand. And although it's melted down in one chapter, it's one of those things you think, oh my God, this is how they game the system. Now I
exactly.
understand it. And here's a law created in the 80s that really is saying the intent of the law is great, as the intent of many laws are great. And then, the unintended side consequences. The intent of the law is to encourage pharmaceutical companies to make drugs for rare genetic diseases for a small patient population. So drug companies would either look at Huntington's disease, something like that. They might look at some type of rare genetic disease and say, you know what, there are only 10,000 patients, 5,000, sometimes even less. Why should we develop any drug for that? Research and development, we can't charge enough for it. So the government gave them all the financial incentives. Now, you're supposed to look for that small patient population, develop the drug, and that's it. But what have they done? They found out ways to game it, such as they get multiple approvals for the same drug by cutting the patient population smaller and smaller over time and getting the sort of the incentives again and again and again with extensions of the patent. In addition, Humira for rheumatoid arthritis, one of the most expensive and one of the most successful drugs in history, listed as an orphan drug. Botox, which people use for cosmetic purposes, originally designated as an orphan drug, and then Allergan takes it and moves it into the public to make it a drug for cosmetic purposes and never pays a penny back on any of the subsidies to the government for the other. Even Gilead with remdesivir, which is out for COVID now, they were shameless. When they first were approaching the FDA for approval on COVID a couple of months ago, they asked for an orphan designation. Why? Because the patient population at the time in the US, this is going back to April, was under 200,000 for COVID. So technically they applied. They knew it would be millions very soon. The all of the age drugs are orphan drugs, although the population has exceeded 200,000 by a lot. And you know what? This isn't rocket science. This could be fixed easily because these were not the loopholes that the original crafters and Henry Waxman and others who created this law intended in the 80s. You could take this law and plug those areas up that are being abused today without a lot of work. I just don't know why anyone hasn't taken it and run with it in the progressive part of Congress.
Well, I think Bernie Sanders and a few people have tried to do maybe not the Orphan Drug Act
Right.
stuff, but about drugs generally. But you're right. This goes back to the influence of the drug companies and lobbyists, but certainly progressives should look at it. So I want to ask you, I want to ask you one last question. and then ask you a wind up question. And the last question I want to ask is the life of a writer. And I think this would be interested for my audience that you finished this book after working on it for several years. You and your amazing wife, Trish, who worked on this as your collaborators, your deep researcher. And you guys finished the book. You're ready to launch on this great book tour. And then the pandemic hits. Now, obviously, and I know you know this yourself, you and me and other people are not like frontline workers, healthcare workers, people in the retail sector who are being exposed literally to this. But this did, to put it mildly, disrupt the whole way in which you wanted to put that book out.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt, and I'm always so reticent to even remotely look as though I'm complaining and say "woe is I" because of the fact that there are people who are impacted so much heavier, as you know, and the economic ladders in terms of COVID. But it is interesting when you still pay. I still pay the bills this way. This is how Tricia and I do it, and we still have a mortgage. So we work our debt down by looking forward to finally publishing the work after a number of years. And we had this date picked. You know how publications work. They had this on the list from last September that it would be coming out on March 10th. Uh, and it turns out that we published on March 10th, and March 11th, the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic, a coronavirus. So we had a 12-city book tour canceled immediately. Some places never picked up again. For instance, lost the possibility of going on Bill Maher in an early time before he went on hiatus. Didn't go to the Harvard bookstore where people show up. A lot of other bookstores became virtual events because you're able to talk and somebody can watch you on the screen, but bookstores were closed. How about publishing? Ask your fellow colleagues. You were former head of the National Writers Union, know dozens and hundreds of writers. How many have ever published into a time, not when there's an event that sucks up all the news like 9/11 or the assassination of a president or world leader or a crisis, but when bookstores had to physically shutter. So the only thing available is online. And it was an odd time. I mean, all we did is the best we could, just soldier forward, talk about the book and hope that somebody's paying attention. But I must tell you that you think to yourself, okay, good timing in the sense that we're talking about drugs a lot. Good timing in the sense that the second last chapter, the penultimate chapter, is titled "The Coming Pandemic," although it doesn't mention COVID in there. But not great timing in the sense that we went into lockdown.
And so I was happy to buy my copy, and I urge my audience to buy the book. It's an amazing book, Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America by Gerald Posner. And so the last question is, in fact, God, we're like telepathic, man, that I, in fact, bookmarked here that point that you made about the pandemic. Obviously, you couldn't be a seer. You couldn't look into the crystal ball and see this, but you quoted a biology professor, Karen Bush, who's saying, you first of all, you describe her feelings. Some of her colleagues worry about avian or swine flu that might morph into more deadly strains in humans. And then a couple of sentences later, you say, the one about which they are most concerned is the one that has not jumped species. Quote, we don't know that until it happens. And essentially, that's what we're going through now. But the real question I want to ask you in the last couple of minutes is this. The one thing I see about the pandemic, as horrible as it is it really has exposed to the whole country the weakness of our economic system, our system as a whole, our social system. And as an eternal optimist, I think that there's this moment where we could come out of this, God, with this horrible death toll and sickness rate, and we're not at the end of that. But I wonder if we're looking at the dawn of a new thinking about how to look both at government regulation, the power of government, the importance of that, and how that specifically would relate to big pharma. And if you had your, magic wand, I gave you all the power coming out of this, what would you say we have to do about big pharma going forward?
Oh well, if I had the magic wand, I would certainly say that I hope that your view of this turns out to be reality, and it does lead to systemic and fundamental changes. I think the risk is, from looking at it as somebody who's researched it, is that big pharma realizes that the pandemic is not just a once in a generation opportunity for big profits, but it also is a very rare opportunity, maybe in 50 years, to rehabilitate their reputation a little bit, because people are so worried about the future and how long COVID will be around and when can we get back to the old normal, much less the new normal, that if they are able to deliver, and that's a big if, a safe and effective vaccine, and they don't get too crazy on price gouging, but make it at a fairly reasonable price, they will rehabilitate their own reputation to some extent. People will be grateful, and that will mean it will be hands off regarding heavy regulation of pharma, because they will have been the magic person for at least one more time. It might buy them a little bit time in the reorganization otherwise of the financial world.
The book again is Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. You all should buy it. It's a great book. Thanks for dropping by, Gerald.
Jonathan, great to see you.
That'll do it for this week's show. Thanks to my guest, Gerald Posner. I want everybody to stay safe out there. Our editor, as usual, is David Hebden. Our major sponsor is the American Postal Workers Union. You too can become one of our small donors. You can do that in two ways, as I said earlier in the show. You can do it either through Patreon, which you can find by going to workinglife.org, clicking on the podcast tab, and finding your way over to Patreon with our link there. Or if you're more comfortable using ActBlue because you're familiar with ActBlue, maybe from your political contributions in the past, we partnered up with ActBlue. So please go over to ActBlue. You can become a one-time sponsor of the show or a regular monthly donor. We would really appreciate it. It helps us keep this show going and helps us keep providing the information I think you're not going to get in other places. Thanks for tuning into the show. Look forward to having you back next week.